All right, let's go ahead and get started for the sake of time. Really excited to have you all here for this important conversation. Welcome to the Diversity by Design webinar series. This series is designed to support district leaders in advancing educator diversity through initiatives with policy and practice. Today's webinar is hosted by TNTP and the 1 Million Teachers of Color campaign, and we are extremely grateful that each of you made the choice to be here today for this conversation, and we hope that it helps you continue to serve your students, educators, and community more equitably. As we go through today's content, please feel free to drop questions in the chat as you have them. And this session will also be recorded and provided to you at the end of the webinar and also posted on all of our major streaming platforms. My name is Stephanie Tomlinson. I'm a director here at TNTP. I come to this work as a fellow educator serving in roles as a teacher, school leader, and state policy representative. I also come to this work in my full humanity as a North Carolina native, a daughter, a partner, a friend that's committed to making this world just a little bit better than I found it. I am so delighted to facilitate today's discussion alongside my colleagues, Nithya and Christine. And we are also really excited for you to hear more from our special guest, one of whom is our CEO, Tukwila Brownie, as well as district representatives from Portland Public Schools. Today's webinar is the first of a series of sessions that are uniquely designed to explore and advance educator diversity by bridging the gap between theory and practice. In today's sessions, we are going to explore three key concepts. First is understanding that educator diversity is a lever to ensure that a district or school's vision for the student experience is realized. When you invest in this and attend to the adults in your community, it helps them create a space for kids. Knowing how to gather and understand data through an equity lens to ensure that your diversification strategy is informed by those that you seek to serve. And finally, finding ways to center your understanding of the landscape through stakeholder voice and experience, specifically students and educators of color. Finally, we hope that today's conversation just continues to reinforce the message that to accomplish our vision for the student experience, we must invest in and attend to our educators, particularly our teachers of color. Over the next 90 minutes, we hope to tell you a compelling story about how we're thinking more expansively about educator diversity and what it looks like to effectively implement these initiatives from a practical lens. We're going to be sharing real case studies and district examples of what we believe should be the first step in any diversification strategy. Understanding your data with an equity lens and doing so in partnership with those that you seek to serve. Before we move into the content of today's session, Nithya is going to share more about the 1 Million Teachers of Color campaign and how its work is guiding today's important conversation.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. And welcome all. My name is Nithya Joseph. I am with TNTP, and I also work very closely with the 1 Million Teachers of Color campaign. So we are just thrilled to offer this content to everyone joining today under the 1 Million Teachers of Color campaign banner in partnership with TNTP. A little bit about the 1 Million Teachers of Color campaign in case you are not familiar. This campaign it seeks to grow the ranks of the nation's teachers and school leaders by 1 million over the next decade. The 1 Million Teachers of Color campaign, TNTP, and our 7 partners that you see listed here in our steering committee represent organizations that are deeply committed to educator diversity because we understand its deep connections to student outcomes, to workforce, and to economic and social mobility. As part of the campaign, we are committed to offering best practices and technical assistance to districts, state, and policymakers who are interested in advancing this issue. So as part of that, we are very thrilled to host the Diversity by Design Learning Series, and of which you all are attending the first session in a 3-part series. So we're excited and ask you, if you have not joined the campaign, we'll drop a link in the chat momentarily to join us to gain more information and understanding about the work that we're doing to advance educator diversity across the country.
Thank you so much, Nithya. Please make sure that you hit that link in the chat and learn more about the campaign and also join us in this effort. As you can see, TNTP is one of the partners of the campaign. Since 1997, TNTP has worked at every level of the U.S. public school system to help our partners and educational inequality achieve the goals for students. TNTP believes that our nation's public schools can offer all children an excellent education. Yet, our schools are struggling to meet this challenge. At TNTP, we are working to disrupt these inequities in public education that deny too many Black and Brown students a chance to lead the lives that they want to lead. And we believe recruiting and retaining more teachers of color is one of the most important ways that we can do this work. We know that the nation faces large discrepancies between staff and students of color, with a 31% gap nationwide. To address this gap, TNTP partnered with the Bar Foundation to support 14 LEAs to analyze their local talent landscape and actively listen to community voices and understand the current student and educator experience in their context. We know that the research is very clear. We know that a more diverse teacher and school leader workforce benefits all students, with even deeper benefits for students of color. We also know that young people need consistent access to strong, diverse workforce to achieve pathways to economic and social mobility. Although this research is not new, our world is really calling for us to think about this research differently in terms of how we do the work and who we bring to the table in partnership. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Tequila Brownie, the Chief Executive Officer of TNTP, where she leads all aspects of the organization's visioning, strategy, operations, and business growth, and also just a wonderful colleague to work with. Before joining TNTP, Dr. Brownie led the design and execution of the district-wide effort to improve student outcomes in Memphis City schools by increasing teacher effectiveness. In her role, she helped build community support for quality education and drove human capital reforms that led to significant policy changes. Dr. Brownie frequently presents the key state legislatures and other leaders and education stakeholders at both the national and local level to drive important policy changes related to educational equity and economic and social mobility. Her own personal journey, which I'm excited for you to learn more about, from a childhood spent in deep rural poverty to Yale to CEO of TNTP, gives her a unique and timely perspective on the complexity of the public school system that undergird our economy. She is a leading voice on the need to revamp education institutions to focus on ensuring a path to thriving for all young people, including those most vulnerable. It is my pleasure to bring forth Tequila so you can hear a little bit more about her and this work that we're in partnership to do in service of our students and educators.
Thank you, Stephanie. And I'm trying, somebody can help me come on video. So okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get started while we get my video. It's saying the host won't let me come on to video, so we'll get that fixed. But I want to go ahead and get started. You can see my photo there, so you can see my smile. Hopefully, the real one will match the one in the nice Photoshop headshot. I just want to welcome you all today and say that we are so thrilled to have everyone joining us, and to thank you for joining us today. I know we have some partners here from Portland Public Schools in Maine that are serving on the panel, so we appreciate you and appreciate, I think I see over 40 participants already, almost 50 participants in the webinar itself. So I want to start out and see a few good friends in the crowd. Betsy Aarons, Harrison Peters, one of our partners at MCEL, Betsy, who leads work with Urban Schools Human Capital Academy, and several other good colleagues and good friends in the work. So I want to start out just by sharing a little bit about why educator diversity is just so important to me and to the sector. You know, when I'm out meeting with state legislators and other leaders, and especially policy leaders in the work, you all know we are living in such divisive times that one of the first questions I encounter is, you know, why educator diversity? Why is this so important? And, you know, what are my thoughts? And so I think people expect me to answer a certain way, that I care about educator diversity because I do identify as a Black woman. And that is true, that from a values perspective and a cultural competence and representation perspective, is it critical that kids see teachers that look like them? Yes. But what I also answer is that you actually need to get underneath that. It's not just teachers of color for teachers of color's sake. As Stephanie shared, the data is unassailable, right? It shows clearly that students benefit from having diverse educators. So this is not just a values conversation. This is about outcomes for students. And so when I ask leaders and others, I'm like, hey, are your kids knocking it out of the park? Are you meeting every one of your goals on academic outcomes for students? And I don't mean just basic proficiency rates where we have, you know, 5 more kids meeting proficiency. I mean, are we truly helping all students reach their maximum potential? Yes, experience strong academic outcomes, but more importantly, succeed and thrive in life. And as you all know, the answer to that question most often is no. For me, my story of origin sort of represents this example. I was born in Memphis, grew up in rural Arkansas, was raised by my grandparents, and I am so fortunate. We didn't have a lot of resources like financial resources, social capital, and some of the things that, you know, affluent and middle class families have. What I did have was, yes, a strong supportive family. And I had grandparents who literally buttoned me and my sister up every single day. And when they shipped us off to school, they were literally entrusting our very lives into the hands of the educators that they sent us to. I was so fortunate. My kindergarten teacher looked like me. My second grade teacher looked like me. My elementary school principal looked like me, and so forth. And so I mention that because the data show the data show that when students of color have access to teachers that look like them, you saw it, they are more likely to have not just improved academic outcomes, but improved life outcomes. And that number exponentially increases when you have access to 2 or more, which is exactly what I did. So growing up in rural Arkansas, living in a house that literally did not even have indoor plumbing, and chopping cotton as a child, I didn't go from that origin story to Yale, the Ivy League, by just luck and by working hard. I got there by having all of the supports that I needed academically, which absolutely included educators that looked like me, and also having the other things like a supportive family, like access to social capital, access to people that were advising and, supporting me. We know that this work will only happen if we have a coherent, evidence-based strategy of supports working together. There are no silver bullets. We all know about the state where we were before COVID as far as student outcomes. The situation is even more dire, right? Given where we are with learning loss as a result of the pandemic. So time becomes even more critical because, again, if we don't accelerate our progress in improving academic and ultimately life outcomes for students and interrupting generational cycles of poverty, then guess what? We're going to continue to lose generations. And so our young people will continue to not be well. That means our communities will continue to not be well. That means our nation will continue to not be well. And so I tell people, we were worried about the balloon. Some people were worried about the balloon and, the balloon from China. And I'm like, we should be paying more attention, frankly, if we want to talk about what's a national crisis and what's not. What is happening in education and our inadequate collective response. It cannot be on the backs of the K-12 sector alone to turn this around. We all have to be working across sectors all together to disrupt this work. What's interesting about the educator diversity work is it's a built-in opportunity for 2-gen strategies, because as Stephanie alluded to in the data, I hope you all know, like 80% of our teachers in our country identify as white, but over 54% of our students identify as students of color. And so that means that educator diversity gap that we wrote about in Broken Pipeline, it means, okay, we're not flying students of color in from Mars, I don't think. That means there are adults that are giving birth and, parents and family members of our very students that we're frankly not tapping into as a pool and a candidate pool for our teacher workforce. Here's the beauty of that. Many of our students' families, especially those that come from poverty, the adults may have, they're working in the gig economy, they're working for poverty wages at full-time jobs. Now, all of us in education know teaching is not a lucrative career, but y'all, it beats a part-time gig job with no benefits. So there's an immediate effect of literally having an impact on students' families when their families become active in the teacher force, because that pay is better than, again, a part-time gig job at a fast food restaurant. And there's a mutual benefit of helping improve student outcomes. So we're really, really excited about the potential for this work to have immediate impacts in that 2-gen framework, both for students in their academic and ultimately life outcomes, and also for their very parents and family members in improving their financial situation immediately. So I'm so proud of TNTP's work in our 1 Million Teachers of Color campaign, which is absolutely about improving and increasing the number of diverse educators, teachers, but also school leaders, and also district lead, like in the whole pipeline, because we did the math and loosely we found that if we are to close that educator diversity gap, we need to add about 1 million new teachers in 10 years. But listen, that's assuming we keep the ones that are already there. So we have a lot of work to do to continue to attract additional teachers and teachers of color into the field, and principals and leaders of color into the field. And then in parallel, retaining the teachers and leaders that are already there. So we're literally looking forward to a future where all students have access to effective, diverse teachers. And for us, it's 3-pronged: quantity, quality, and diversity. Betsy's work at the urban schools, Betsy was a partner for me when I led the work in Memphis. And I hope you all know, we can't just, people are talking about the teacher shortage and just talking about warm bodies. Our students, our kids deserve better than just saying we need warm bodies. We need effective, diverse teachers. If you're going to get to quality, you have to have minimum of 5, but ideally like a 10-to-1 ratio of candidates to even screen for quality. And guess what? Within those numbers, you can prioritize diversity to make sure that you're not choosing diversity or quality. They go hand in hand. And so I encourage you to take part in this 3-part series. I welcome you today. Explore some of these foundational steps that you can to look more deeply in understanding the experience of not only your students of color, but your educators of color, and particularly the data that you need to do to, first of all, commit to establishing this as a goal. If all of your children are not being successful now, you need to prioritize the under-tapped lever of educational diversity. So the webinar, this learning series, is focused on giving you actionable tools and resources so that you can take those to bear and put them into place to begin to effect change now. So thank you again so much for joining us today. I appreciate the hard work that you all are doing every single day. Enjoy the webinar, and I'm going to pass this back to Stephanie.
Thank you, Tequila. That was amazing. Thank you for your words of wisdom. And As we transition back into this discussion, as Tequila noted, systems are delivering exactly what they're designed to do. And this work is about disrupting the inequities within that design. Our mindsets cannot be underestimated in this work, particularly the initial process of understanding the current state and being open to what it is that we're hearing, seeing, and experiencing. This is hard work. I think we all know that. It's hard, but it's doable and within our locus of control. Let's do a quick poll. Really curious about who's in the room and where you feel like you are on this journey. When you think about your efforts to diversify the educator workforce, where are you and your district in this journey? There's no right answer. As you think about this learning curve, as you look at this visual, curious to see where you are. We have just about half of participants who participated. I'll give another 20 to 30 seconds to get some more answers in before we share the results. Perfect. As you can see through these results, that we are all coming into this space at different places. I think a lot of us have acknowledged that this is complicated. There are some things that resonate with us, some things that we're still figuring out. We ask that you continue to engage in this partnership from a learning orientation. Pay attention to how you're feeling, where you are in the learning curve, where you leave in the learning curve after today's conversation. As leaders of leaders, we acknowledge that we do not hold all the answers, and that's okay. Honor where you are, embrace what you know, but also where you have room to grow. This learning orientation should continue to be your guiding post throughout today's session. And with that, I would love to pass it over to my amazing colleague, Christine Love, who's going to share more about what it looks like to look at your data and do so with an equity lens.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Stephanie. And thanks again to Dr. Tooele Brownie for setting the stage for the series. My name is Christine Love, and I am a partner here at TNTP. I've had the privilege of leading the team that partnered with the initial 14 LEAs in the cohort over the past 2 years, starting with a focus on understanding the local talent landscape centered on student and educator experiences. And I'm so happy to be here with you all today and talk a little bit more about one of those foundational steps to better understanding what your landscape looks like so that you can chart a path forward to meet your goals when it comes to your kids and the educators who serve them every day. So let's get started by understanding data through an equity lens. It's really critical that systems and schools look deeply at their data and hear from their community to pinpoint those specific challenges. We need to really understand the root causes, the nuance of the issues, the potential bright spots to explore, and the pain points that need immediate attention. This requires us to look at multiple types of data over a period of time. That could be quantitative data, it could be qualitative data. Sometimes we hear the word data and immediately check out. There's graphs, there's statistics, there's percentages, there's equations, but data ultimately is information. Data should highlight and validate people's experiences, especially the experiences of those most minoritized. When the data and what you hear don't align, that's actually a great tipping point. It's time to reevaluate the data. Traditional data can only show you what happened or how folks responded, but they don't actually articulate for you the why behind it. So today, when we talk about data, I want us to think about it as evidence, context, experiences. Data can be words, strategies, pictures, language. And if we fail to pause and truly explore the nature of the problem, we make assumptions. We tell our own stories, and there's the danger of a single narrative. Then we ourselves are contributing to the ongoing inequities for kids and educators. Dimensions of identity and dynamics of power and privilege show up in each aspect of the process of collecting data and making sense of it. It shows up in our everyday life, but when we are looking at data, it is constant. Data is not objective as much as we wish it was. Our identity shows up in the questions we're trying to answer, the participants we might engage, the way we make sense of the data, and the headlines we identify as having value, as well as the stories we determine to use. So we have to recognize the power in the relationship when it comes to looking at data, the power to decide with whom to do empathy work, the power to interpret the results, the power to decide the framing of the problem, and then the power to pick the best solution. We also know that power and privilege are always present, particularly for white educators like myself, and especially when focusing on the nuance of educator diversity. It is important to attend to the power we each wield and understand and recognize the impact of our identity and our role in thinking through the means to mitigate, address, and communicate that power and privilege. It's also why it is so important to ensure we hear from our stakeholders, center the voice of students and educators of color, and constantly reference and determine whose voice, perspective, and experience is missing. So we'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. But let's pause for a moment and consider, as you think about your role, your community, your space, what is the power you hold as you lead the design and implementation of the data you hope to gather, collect, analyze, and ultimately act on when it comes to educator diversity? We set a couple of guiding principles in the cohort experience that Stephanie outlined for you that launched in 2021. We leveraged guiding principles that are actually adapted from trial trends, which you might be familiar with. There are other frameworks, though, that center racial equity and are applicable to any sort of landscape analysis or engagement with a broader group to review data and come up with solutions. For example, equity by design is a really popular framework. A framework, though, at its core provides really common language, and it's a means to hold you and your team accountable along the way. Make sure that your values are being realized in every decision you make, every step you take, every action that you pursue. It also helps ensure that the questions you want to answer are the right ones. They're rooted in your context, in your community, and they consider the individual bias that we as humans always bring to the table. So having a framework is a means to come back and reset each time. So let's ground ourselves in the what that the cohort explored. And what I would say is a strong recommendation from TNTP to you all as leaders to consider as you start your educator diversity journey. Let's ground ourselves there. So this is how we approached and understanding the core issues in a variety of different communities and spaces. And a talent landscape analysis is a fancy set of words for a set of guiding questions you want to answer about your school community, the collection and analysis of the quantitative and qualitative data that will help you answer those questions, a review of materials and processes that are already in place, and a deep understanding of your most critical stakeholders' experiences, specifically our kids and our teachers or our broader educators. You can customize the questions you want to answer based on your priorities or how recently you analyzed components of your talent process, but you want to be sure you are always undergirding the work with stakeholder input and centering the experience of BIPOC kids, educators, families, and caregivers. So for example, when we call out culture, we might want to know what is the racial and ethnic diversity of our kids, our educators, our broader community. Where is their alignment? Where is their gaps? What kids have access to which educators for what content, and who share the components of identity across those spaces. For recruitment and selection, we might want to know, are we attracting enough high quality, diverse applicants across all content areas, just like Tukwila mentioned? Do we have the opportunity to be selective? And are specific pipelines producing more candidates of color in STEM fields? For retention and staffing, we want to know what are motivating teachers of color to stay. Do certain schools or content areas have better attrition rates? When we look at development, what opportunities are available? Who is taking advantage of those opportunities? And those are just some initial questions. We will be providing as follow-up a resource with a whole bank of exploratory questions you could consider. There are many types of data to also dig into when you think about the questions you want to answer. That could be applicant tracking system data. That could be personnel and workforce data. That could be publicly available data on State Department of Education websites or reporting related to demographics, certification areas. It could be student performance, evaluation data, school-based budgets, district-based budgets, class rosters, pipeline projections, census data, and then surveys, focus groups, and interviews. Those were just a lot of words, and that might sound overwhelming. To do a comprehensive analysis, it does require really dedicated capacity and a clear investment from leaders to set that clear vision and reinforce how the process should be experienced, back to those guiding principles around what do we want folks to see and hear. But you can really work with what you have. You can start from any place of information. You can be as narrow as you need or as narrow as the capacity allows. You can focus on certain questions at a time and sequence it out, gradually building a more holistic understanding of your analysis. You can build on work you've already done or other partners have already done, or even publicly available information that comes from both federal and local and state organizations. So with that framing in mind, we're going to take a look at a few examples from the cohort experience. So we explored data from at least the past 3 years, sometimes up to 5, 6, 7 years, to identify trends, gaps, and opportunities, and break it down by different aspects of identity and experience. So in this example, our LEAs wanted to answer the question, at what rate are we hiring diverse teachers? And is the selection process identifying diverse, effective teachers that we hire? So we used application data, selection and hiring data here to answer these questions, breaking it down by the percent that were in turn hired by different race and ethnicities. We also found that in the absence of data, particularly demographic data, it was challenging to determine those root causes or understand if there were differences in candidate and educator experience by race or ethnicity or other aspect of identity. So they could answer their first question here. 36% of applicants in the hiring process moved beyond that initial online application, but they were not capturing demographic data. So without that data, it's really difficult to assess how candidates of color specifically move through the pipeline and hiring process. So we're left unsure how candidates of color experience that process in terms of the data related to outcomes or outputs. We can't say with this information if we're unintentionally screening candidates out. But many LEAs aren't actually tracking applicant data, or they don't have a unique identifier to pair that data with those who end up being hired and in front of our kids. So in these instances, I do like to remind us that the absence of data isn't of itself a finding. It's something to act on. A landscape analysis is simply the initial step to really spark action and inform direction and help narrow in on the most impactful steps for your kids and your educators. So if you don't have the data, then you can start collecting it or understand how to access it. So acknowledge the gap and the incomplete story and note your clear next steps. So with limited data or incomplete data, which we know is a consistent challenge across LEAs, not just those in this cohort experience, but those we have worked with in over 25 years. This is why it's particularly important to use a mixed methods research approach, which is basically gathering multiple types of data sets across a variety of different interfaces. So as you start to ask why questions, so we just went through that example of why this, why that, you start to dig deeper and you cut the data in new ways. And as you create these storylines around what you're finding, the importance of the mixed methods approach increases. So in the cohort, our storylines were greatly influenced by the triangulation of different data sources. So ensuring we had multiple perspectives and sources to paint a full picture. That means we didn't share all of our analysis and findings, even though it is very tempting to pull out the 100 different data points, but rather those that were comprehensive or had a high level of confidence that they truly identified the root causes. In addition, we intentionally checked in along the way with our partner teams and broader groups of stakeholders to disarm or affirm assumptions, check our integrity of the data, capture additional context, or think about ways we might want to dig in a little deeper, which also helped to reduce bias across the board. So let's use this example to illustrate that exploratory storytelling process and the triangulation of data. This is one of our cohort LEAs, and they had a lot to celebrate when we looked at their data. They more than doubled the percentage of teachers of color in their broader LEA community from the 2019-2020 school year to 48% in the 2021-22 school year. And that is considerable growth. So the question immediately is, how did they accomplish that? So we first took a look at hiring rates, and we saw a little bit of progress, but nothing to explain that dramatic improvement. So we wanted to take a look at retention of that LEA staff over a similar period of time. So you can see between the blue and orange lines that teacher retentions increased considerably over a similar period of time, ultimately hitting 100% of staff being retained from the 2020 school year to the 2021-2022 school year. So there was significant growth for both teachers of color and white teacher retention. And ultimately, that gap between teachers of color and white teachers was eliminated over a 5-year period. So that immediately prompted us to say, what changed? What contributed to that increased retention rate? Because that is a big bit of growth in a short period of time. So we looked to surveys and focus groups notes and pulled out data related to the overall experience of educators and identified some bright spots that really supported them to stay based on their experiences. And when we disaggregated that data by race, we actually saw no real differences in what was driving people to stay in that community, in that LEA space. So on the left is a chart of survey responses that highlight overall culture, colleagues, and leadership as the most important reason that they stay in that LEA school community. And we pulled out quotes from conversations and reflected on other survey questions, specifically those related to development, equity and inclusion, and overall LEA vision and direction. And as a result of pulling out those different pieces and the voices of our stakeholders, we were able to paint a more holistic picture about the why behind the outcomes, which has allowed folks to actually move and create concrete strategies to address that. So let's continue to explore the role of stakeholder experience in the process of understanding the current state and our root causes. Let's talk about stakeholders. As Stephanie mentioned earlier in her overview, to fully realize the promise of education, we must create systems and cultures within our schools to ensure that children and the adults who teach them are seen, heard, and valued. At the end of the day, this is people work. We're talking about human interactions. And this is particularly important for our kids of color and our educators of color, who have traditionally been marginalized in all spaces across the country. We just talked about triangulating different data sources and ensuring that the perspectives and experiences of educators and kids being particularly critical. We found in our partnerships across the cohort that the power of BIPOC staff and students' words humanized the data that we articulated. It clarified really essential actions, and it ultimately was the most compelling evidence of change and accelerated change for our LEA partners. We know the research is very clear about the impact of teachers on a single kid's trajectory, and even greater impact of teachers of color for all kids, but particularly for kids of color. Stephanie and Tukwila shared some specifics earlier. We consider educators really broadly, including all of the adults in the school and community who support and contribute to student learning, so not just the direct classroom instructor. In the cohort, we saw that many of the adults outside of direct classroom instruction were far more diverse and were an untapped resource and potential pipeline to consider who is leading our kids' learning. So let's pause for a moment and reflect on how you might center the educators and students that you work with daily. How can you bring them into this work to be actual stakeholders at the table? So let's check in on authentic engagement. To set the stage and norm, authentic engagement requires really purposeful planning. There are risks when you blindly engage with a community. Missteps can cause distrust or burn bridges. And it's important to prepare to engage and understand context, know what your ask is of your stakeholders, as well as how you intend to use perspectives and input. Basically, what is your commitment back to your stakeholders if they engage with you and share the information and experience that they have in their experience? So I'm going to share a couple of just general guiding principles when it comes to engagement that we really stuck to in our cohort experience and across different partnerships across the country. Some of this is, again, taken from Child Trends, which is a tremendous resource, or synthesized from some of our recent learnings. But the first is know the context. How is power distributed? Who are the key influencers? What's the historical relationship with community groups, with both schools and the district, but broader organizations? Clarify the issue. Do you know how the community already perceives the issue? What language is used? Identify root causes. What has already been identified or validated? And how do your learning questions acknowledge what has already been explored? And then finally, valuing stakeholder time. This is the one that's particularly important to me and one that I think is really key for sustainable change and ongoing cycles of engagement. What do you plan to do with the information you gather? Don't ask questions that you don't plan to take into understanding and consider as your broader findings. What opportunities already exist that you can invite yourself into, rather creating new spaces? How will you ensure accessibility across home languages, location, transportation, work mobility, work schedules? And ultimately, how will you value the time and perspective that your stakeholders shared back with you? So to wrap up this section, before we hear from our wonderful team in Portland, I want to share another example of some of our LEA cohort learnings. We can pretty easily analyze the alignment of student and educator identities. We can pretty quickly identify where there's gaps or if there's been progress made. More often than not, this is publicly available information, but it doesn't actually capture for us which students have access to which teachers, specifically those teachers who share their identity. So this type of survey question that you can see on the screen helps better illustrate what that means for students day to day and who is in front of them in their classroom. So this data captures all 14 LEAs, and across the LEAs in our cohort, half of BIPOC students reported having a teacher that is the same race as them over some point during their time in school. Meanwhile, 84% of white students reported having a teacher that is the same race over their past year of student experience. So then we took a look and thought, well, let's layer in some student voices and their personal experiences. Like, let's clarify what that means. The quantitative data of the survey result is then brought to life. So the impact is more concrete on what it is for an individual person, an individual student. So here we had quantitative data from a student survey that captures the impact of having teachers of color. And then we coupled it with qualitative responses on the right that capture the why that they answered the way in which they did. It is one thing to look at percentages and numbers and know that you want to see progress in one direction or another. It is another to read the words of a student that says, I have never had a teacher who is the same race as me. It would help break through that barrier that is present. Or having a Hispanic teacher understand what it's like to have an immigrant parent, that you are the only person here in the United States and you're representing your family, carries a different weight and paints a different picture. So similarly, as we're gathering educator experience via survey and then desegregating by race, it helps us to identify those root causes, giving us more evidence that can really influence and narrow in on decisions. So for this example, across all of the cohort, We found that a majority of staff at nearly every LEA indicated they're comfortable bringing their full identity to work. So that's that overall dotted line you see across the horizontal line. But BIPOC educators were less likely to feel this way, and the gaps between demographic groups varied from 13 to 27%, depending on the LEA. And this chart is just a snapshot of about half of our LEAs, with BIPOC staff articulated in navy and white staff responses in gray. So for those LEAs with the greatest gap between white and BIPOC teacher experience, we took a closer look at the open-ended responses to questions, and we referenced focus group and survey notes that had been coded to key themes. And we wanted to dig into those experiences and identify the why behind this. And when we did that, we identified a couple of core concepts: isolation, being othered in spaces, or being the only person of color or the only Black male teacher; microaggressions or direct acts of racism that were ignored or not addressed; extra asked of teachers of color to carry DEI work on their own; a lack of support or inconsistent engagement and commitment from white colleagues as well. Now, this looked different across and within the LEAs, but it provided a really detailed list of the current experience of BIPOC teachers and why that experience looks different, along with specificity on how to address it. So again, this is a lot of information that you would need to cull down into the most important headlines. And that helps you inform what steps you can take, what strategies you prioritize, and really where you most dramatically can shift the experience of kids by shifting the experience of educators. The more information you have, the more prepared and informed you can be to do the hard work of shifting school experiences for everyone in the space. So with that in mind, let's hear from one of our partners from the cohort. I'm going to hand it back to Stephanie so that we can hear from the amazing team at Portland Public Schools, who have been just tremendous partners to our team. And we've been really thankful that we've had the opportunity to learn more about them and their broader school community.
Thank you, Christine. So as you know, Christine noted, we are really excited to have the opportunity to work with Portland Public Schools and just learn more about like what this work has looked like in their context and sort of what the experience has been like for them. Portland Public Schools has worked diligently within this cohort experience to understand their educators and their students in some really authentic ways, which has led to some notable progress in their diversification efforts. They were able to listen to their community and create a shared vision with priorities, engage with stakeholders across the city, define equity as a strategic priority in the district, and develop an Educators of Color report after engaging with every single teacher of color in their community. So in today's panel, our Portland team is prepared to share more about what they did, how they did it, and what has changed in their district as a result. So it is my pleasure to welcome Julia Hazel, the Director of BIPOC Career Pathways and Leadership Development in Portland Public Schools; Andy Summers, the Executive Director of the Foundation for Portland Public Schools; and Barrett Wilkinson, the Executive Director of People and Equity at Portland Public Schools.
We're not able to start our videos, I don't think.
Oh, well, let's see if we can fix that. Sorry. Hi, Andy.
Hello.
Good to see you. All right. And let's see if we can get Julia here. Wonderful. I think we got everyone. Thank you so much for being here to speak more about your experiences and your ongoing engagement in the Driving Toward Diversity cohort. To start, I would love for each of you to provide a brief introduction and just share more about your background and experience in education, specifically speaking to how your work has centered this work in educators of color and students of color in your community. And Julia, we can start with you.
Hi, everybody. It's great to be here. I will always identify as a teacher. So I was an elementary and middle school teacher for 16 years, always working in schools that were majority BIPOC students. And as an educator of color myself, moving to Portland and starting to see a real disparity between staff and students really prompted me to start to think, how do we create community of support among our BIPOC staff members? And how do we do some of the culture work and education of all staff members so that we can better serve this diverse group of students? So I kind of started that work while I was still a classroom teacher, and now I full-time get to move this work forward, which is fantastic, through our People and Equity department. And I can pass it to Andy.
Thanks, Julia. I started my career as a teacher as well. I was in the classroom for 10 years. And I would say that I started not very aware of issues of race and the importance of diversifying the educator workforce, and kind of grew that awareness throughout my career. I taught in Maine and Rhode Island, and then I taught internationally. My daughter attended school in Lima, Peru. And so I started to have some awareness of the experience of being kind of othered in a culture. Came back to the United States, worked at an immigration legal aid clinic for a bunch of years, where my personal transformation and understanding of the immigrant community in Portland really grew a lot. And then started working as a school coach at a nonprofit, in some ways similar to TNTP, based here in Portland, and really started learning and focusing on the importance of this work. So when I took my current role as the director of the Foundation for Portland Public Schools, we're the public education foundation that supports the district here. It was clear to me right away that in our resources around community engagement and bringing external resources into the district, that this work needed to be one of our top priorities. So that's what we've been doing for a few years. Barrett?
Pleasure to be with you all. My name is Barrett Wilkinson. I'm the Executive Director for People and Equity, which is what we call our HR department for the district. I've been with the district for about 6 years, and I initially came on board to work on the strategic plan focus of equity. And one of the things that relates to our conversation today is really about the work around supporting adults as they evolve in their understanding of equity, literacy, and racial inequity and racial justice and all of those things. My background is not in education. My background's in public health and violence prevention. And I've worked throughout the US and internationally, really adjacent to schools my whole career. And so this is my first time working really in depth in a single school district around these types of issues. So my entry point has really been more about, in this case, has really been more about the adults and working on how do we do meaningful conflict resolution and prevention education and equity and, all of those things together.
Wow, what a powerhouse of folks here. And I think it's a really good transition as we hear about each one of your personal journeys into this work and why it matters to you, like how all of this has kind of culminated into what this vision has looked like for Portland Public Schools. So what is Portland Public Schools' vision for educators of color, and how has that vision been informed by your community? And feel free to chime in. All of you could chime in, or one or two of you. We really want this to be an open, authentic, and honest conversation. So we'd love to hear more about that vision.
I get excited talking about this because I think this vision is really what pushes me day to day to keep doing our best work, because we really envision a school system where BIPOC educators are thriving. like there was a quote that has stayed with me, is the idea that like equity is not just for the students, it's for the staff members as well. And like when we conducted our educator of color research and had these like couple of hour interviews with BIPOC staff members, we had a lot of staff members who have been in our district for like 10, 15, 20 years, but I really couldn't describe them as thriving. I think they are surviving and they're getting through the days and the weeks and the years. And so my vision is like that we move towards a place where we see our BIPOC staff members really in their full selves, fully included, fully having a sense of belonging, not tokenized, really deeply valued. You know, we've heard a lot of stories about like the ways that racism comes through in school culture. And so I have this vision of like, what would it look like to really authentically have these multicultural school environments where there's really this idea that the more different perspectives and different approaches and different identities that we bring, like enriches the work that we're doing and makes us better able to meet our students. You know, it's also, I think, definitely a vision where some of the barriers that people describe to us of like structures that are in place that reinforce white supremacy, that we have removed those barriers when they're, you know, and supported people through the structures that are beyond us and change the structures that are within our organization so that they provide opportunity for everybody. And I get really excited for like that vision of like a staff that truly is representative of our student body, and not just in an optics way, not just for like brochures, but in the sense of like the guiding energy and culture and values of our organization being like really reflected in our staff and in their lived experience, right? Because we can say we believe these things, but if people's lived experience still isn't aligned, then we still have work to do.
Thank you for sharing that, Julia. Barrett, Andy, either of you want to add anything additional to that?
I guess the only piece I would add is, you know, I don't know if this is a fair answer to the question for the vision of educators of color, but for the vision of our community, I mean, we have heard loud and clear from our students and families how much representation matters and how much students have not seen themselves in their teachers and school leaders. You know, if it's fair to include that in our vision for educators of color, I guess I would say that, you know, that our students feel like they're part of a community where they see themselves too. I mean, and that's ultimately, we want our educators to feel a strong sense of belonging. But fundamentally, we're all in, you know, it's all about serving students. And we couldn't hear it more clearly from our students that they really feel this need. So.
And you all invested a lot of time, capacity, and energy into this. Like when we think about the cohort experience that you all went through with us, when we did that talent landscape analysis and really dug, you know, underneath the foundation of what was happening in your community, what was surprising to you about the data in that landscape analysis, and how did you go about sharing the findings of that back with the Portland community?
Yeah, I'll start with this one because we had a little plan, but we knew our numbers. I mean, we knew that we were about half students of color and less than 10% staff of color. I mean, that we knew that going into our partnership with TNTP, but it was really interesting and helpful to hear how families, white families as well as BIPOC families, really felt the need for change and diversification, that came out of the focus groups that TNTP helped us run. And we also had a sense of how kind of weak our data practices were around recruitment and retention. But until we started kind of being asked these hard questions and seeing it in that visualization, we didn't really realize how much data, how many systems we needed to build and how much data we would need to collect. And that like having that summarized really helped us focus our priorities moving forward. And we're not there yet, but in what we needed to do. So I guess that would, I don't know if Barrett or Julia, you want to jump in on the reactions to the data part first before we talk about sharing it.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything you said. I think that in, you know, sort of the summary in total did help us see like there are some places where we're headed in the right direction. And what's cool and hopeful about Portland and why I continue to like be deeper and deeper rooted in this work in this community is because you can make that change. Like it's a big enough city where you have the dynamics of any place, but you can get to the right people and you can actually start to make change, and you can see it reflected. And so I think that, you know, like Andy was saying, like a lot of the numbers were like, okay, we knew that's what we were dealing with, but then some of the things we were doing to address that both at student levels, at staff levels, and community levels were starting to matter.
And I think it's very like, I feel like it's very important that we're always looking at our stakeholders, right? And that it's not just sort of this group of people in leadership roles determining like the course forward. So to what Andy was saying about like, this was coming, like our families were saying, this is a priority for us. And that was across their racial identity, felt very confirming of like, yes, this is the right direction. This isn't just the right direction because like nationally, this is an issue. It's the right direction because our community is feeling the absence of this. And is giving us like that imperative that we need to really push for this.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious about, you know, and maybe Andy, this is probably where you were going about how you operationalized, like internalizing the data and then creating a plan to share that back out to your community. Like, what did that look like? It's a lot of different moving priorities in the district. Like, how did you do that thoughtfully?
Yeah, well, I have to start with a shout out to our team from TNTP. I mean, you all are phenomenal. Like we have had a lot of folks, but like Nahaya, Kevin, Dustin, the other folks in our team, like they're so good. They're so helpful. So they helped us make a one pager that because we, you know, that our you know, the landscape analysis we received is a big document. So we did share it with the cabinet, with the leadership team. And we spent, you know, 90 minutes digging into it with that group, with our superintendent and others. We shared it with our school board, but it was not the right thing to share with kind of the staff and with parents and with students and all of those other partners. So we created a one-page document that kind of like put forward like the purpose and objective, like, we want more educators of color. This is why, this is what we heard, and this is what we plan to do. And we had that translated into the 8 primary languages of our community. And we put it out in a whole bunch of ways. Like it went out in the like standard things, like we have a bi-monthly staff and community newsletter and on the website and on social media. And then we have a bunch of groups that we talked it through with. There's a family parent advisory council that serves the district that represents families around the district. We're really fortunate to have a community group that we work with called Portland Empowered that specifically has a mission of engaging immigrant students and parents in school improvement and reform and leadership efforts. So we worked with their parent and student groups to help, you know, kind of understand our findings and where we were. I don't know what I'm forgetting, but we put a lot of time into that piece of it. And certainly we didn't hit close to everybody, but we did put it out, and we put it out visually and had a whole series of conversations around like what we were planning to do next and why.
Barrett, Julia, I'm using my teacher pause to see if you wanted to add anything, but I'm happy to like move us forward. And we feel like Andy pretty much hit the largest pieces of that.
Andy nailed it.
Great. I love it. I'm also thinking about, you know, all of the things that you all have been able to do, like once you got that data. How has that helped you serve the students, the educators, and folks in your community differently than before when you actually were looking at that data to build that story? Curious about some specifics on ways that has trickled down, I think, from the district level and like moving down into the individual schools to impact the educators and students that you're hoping to serve here.
I think it's like definitely kind of we were moving in this direction, and then getting that influx of like more specific data helped us to be more targeted in our approaches. So I can, like, in terms of like that recognition that like our racial identities don't match our student racial identities. One change that I've seen is in our elementary level, and I think that we've recruited the majority of our BIPOC teachers had been in middle school and high school. And over the past couple of years, we've recruited a number of BIPOC elementary teachers, which I think is going to really change the way those numbers look for like I've had a teacher who reflects my racial identity. It also, along with our insight survey results, which helped us to really zero in on some of like the subgroups. Like one thing that was a real takeaway was this recognition that both Asian staff and students were a group that was feeling the least connected and the least represented. And so one action that we're going to take this year is to have like an Asian staff specific affinity group. We have had in the past like a general all BIPOC staff together, but realizing like we need some extra tending and care for these groups that are feeling even more marginalized. We're also like some of the things about retention. Like I think that like Andy said, we knew that we really hadn't had any systemic process for looking closely at that. And I think that the findings really pushed us to start to think about that like from a lot of different angles. So from like the leadership angle, Barrett and I lead professional development monthly with our school leaders and department directors. And we've really focused on like, what does it look like to build a culture of belonging? What does it look like to have difficult conversations? What does it look like to do equity oriented hiring? So really kind of trying to build that training in, and we're going to continue that this year and kind of like spiral around to some similar topics and then deepen and add some new ones. In my roles, one piece of retention that we're looking at that came up is like, okay, so if there's a pattern of more of our non-renewals being BIPOC staff, like let's look really closely at like, what is our teacher evaluation process? How do we like help everyone get on the same page of giving feedback more earlier and creating more like of a process for people to get support? And like, let's review our new teacher mentoring program. How can we ensure that there's like more robust support for all of our new teachers and things that are universal design that are going to lift the experience for BIPOC staff? We took time. We had an equity hiring toolkit, and I think Barrett will probably talk about this more, but we revised it and tried to like really go back and kind of say, this is how we want you to use this. This is like the purpose of this. The TNTP team helped us to write an employee value proposition to really distill like who we are as an organization and like put that on our website. And like really like, I think we just in the past have not really looked closely at what is our outward facing, like what do people see when they first come, when they apply for a job, like how does that go? And like, so really doing some work to like, how do we make that process simpler? How do we like really trim away things that are going to be a deterrent to people or be challenging if you're doing it on your phone or if English is not your primary language? And I think some of the places that we want to go that we haven't done yet is like, there was definitely a clear interest from caregivers and being part of hiring processes. We haven't done too much of that. We've done it at the leadership level, like for superintendents and school leaders, but I'm really curious to see how we could involve students and caregivers in more of our hiring processes and how that might change those conversations. I think that that's still a place where it's like we have the tools and still there's this moment in the committee where they're making a decision and they're reviewing like the data and competencies of different candidates. And like, I still think that that's definitely a place where there's a lot of challenge and nuance and growth and like ways to like talk about how bias comes up and talk about like, what are the competencies that are like our bottom lines and what are the areas where we can allow people to grow. So there's just a lot there. I think that I always am like, it gets worse before it gets better. It's like you pull everything out of the closet and it's like a mess, but then you can at least see like all the things. So I feel like when we got the landscape analysis, it was like, here's all of these things and we want to do like all of them, but like trying to like build and keep going. So yeah, and I would really, really like to see those metrics change in terms of like staff and students feeling like they can bring their full identity to work. Like 1/3 of our BIPOC staff feeling comfortable to do that is like, that takes such a toll on you. I've been in that boat. It takes a huge toll. And like, that is not going to lead to retention. It's not going to lead to people who are at their best selves to serve our students. And students, like 50% of our students across all racial groups, like those numbers are things that I'm excited to see change. So I said a lot of things, but Barrett and Andy, go ahead. Please add on.
I think you hit on so many of the important pieces related to that. I mean, I think that what when I look back on it in moments like this, I'm like, okay, some of it was, we had a strategic plan that like elevated the importance of talking about all these things. And then we figure out, okay, let's try all these different strategies. And, through the work with TNTP, I know Andy's already shouted them out, and not to overinflate our team, but they really have been brilliant. And the value of external expertise is not to be understated because it's been helpful for both little and big things. So like one example that like, I was like, of course we should have thought of that, was like if you started an application in our system, it would send you sort of a rather aggressive email if you hadn't finished. And like, there's no need for that. And so they were like, do you guys want to change that? And we were like, of course we want to change that. And so then they changed that with like, they helped propose language, and so like, it's that building belonging from the moment someone chooses to like say like, oh, I might be interested in this place. Like, what are they up to? And so it's the things like Julia said, it's the value proposition, putting that up front, making sure people understand like, this is part of our stated values. And then, sort of another evidence of that is, having, seen some of the hires and talk to people at the hiring process after they were hired. They'll learn about our equity hiring toolkit and some of the work we've done. And they're like, oh, that was very obvious to me, actually. Like they'll say like, it was very clear to me that was a priority for you during the interview process. And they wouldn't have necessarily known that. And like, they're people who we hired. So they must have done a good job with, what were the competencies we were looking for in that. But that was cool, to kind of have that feedback from a recent hire, whether it was a teacher or an administrator saying like, oh, I definitely feel this value. Like I'm seeing this. And from the get-go, that's really important to me, that's what we're starting with.
Those are phenomenal examples. And it is a really nice segue, I think, into the last question I wanted to ask before we give the audience an opportunity to ask you all some things is, before the talent landscape analysis, you noted that you did not have the strongest of data systems. And now that you know that and you have access to this data, like, how are you integrating it into your practice now as leaders? Like, how do you look at your data regularly? What does that practice look like? What are the challenges that you're coming up against? Be just great to hear about how that integration has happened or changed the way that you all have operated as leaders since, looking at this data?
Well, I'm happy to start, and then Julie and Andy, perhaps you'll have other perspective to add, but I would say I would say it's still a muscle that's developing for us. I think that initially, I would say our practices were really pretty weak. And some of it was, that we didn't know what data we had or how to access it well. And some of it was there wasn't that data collected in any way that was meaningful. And so, like, one example of that is I would annually do an equity audit. I'm just going to use the hiring example. I would do an equity audit of our hiring practices, not even to understand who's in the pipelines or getting through, but like who as hiring managers was actually doing what we asked of them, that are practices that we know improve the hiring process. And so, kind of going back and saying like, okay, did they do a competency-based hiring? Did they do performance tasks? Did they have a pool, did they have a pool of people on their hiring committee? Or was it just, the principal and one other person? Were they doing the things that we know contribute to, a better pipeline and better outcomes, particularly for BIPOC talent? So that was sort of like homegrown data we would have to generate. I think we're in a better place, and TNTP again has been really helpful in like gleaning through some of that as we continue to build the muscle around like, okay, now here's how we're going to look at retention data. So it's not, we're taking both the qualitative and matching it with the quantitative and saying, okay, here's what it's feeling like, here's what we're seeing, and what is the data saying too, so that we're really putting that entire picture together. So those are sort of the things that come to mind of like how we're going to evolve that. And again, Julia spoke to that. We lead monthly training with all of our school leaders, so principals, assistant principals, program directors, assistant directors. And, we're going to really push this year in particular around our TNTP survey data related to retention. So, we're going to try and build more collective muscle around how we use some of the other data, not just at the district level, but at the school site level around that. So again, it's not all, we do not have it all figured out. It's absolutely emerging, and things we're still, working and thinking on.
I just wanted to add one little piece to what Barrett said, which is I think that our our superintendent's executive team is very immersed in data and is in the habit of looking at it. I think with Julia and Barrett's leadership, that team of administrators, building administrators, is getting there, and the expectations are clearer, and like the purpose and understanding. And I think I had like this wonderful, just anecdotal moment of like, this is reaching teachers just this week. I was talking to a friend who is a teacher, who's a teacher in the district, someone I know who lives in my neighborhood, and talking about how we're hiring at the foundation. And he said, oh yeah, I've been here 20 years. I mean, it's so great, like to have, the same set of interview questions for every candidate. There's just this new set of questions I saw this year that was so helpful. And I was like, that's the set of questions we made up with TNTP. Like, it was just like so cool to hear that, like, oh, you were on a hiring committee at your school and you saw that resource. Like, it's working. So that was kind of cool, because I think it's very hit or miss, with those teams at schools.
Thank you all for sharing your experience and also just doing the work. Like, it is difficult work to do, but the fact that Portland Public Schools has come such a long way and where you started, and like really taking ownership over this, like when I think about the mindset shifts that needed to happen to be able to move this forward, it's really inspiring to hear and see. I want to pause and see if we have any questions, or allow folks from the audience to ask a few questions. We have a couple minutes for that. I know that there was one thing that came up earlier in the webinar about what are the primary data sources used during the landscape analysis. You all can speak to that from Portland's perspective, but Christine, if you want to layer in there, you're welcome to come in to the conversation and share as well.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I popped in a quick answer in the chat, but just to verbalize it a bit, we looked at a variety of data sources, and I'm sure Barrett and Andy and Julia can remember the fun of all those data requests, but we looked at state DOE data, so things like demographics and certification and pipeline projections and enrollees. Most of that is publicly available information. It certainly was in Maine and in Massachusetts and Vermont and Connecticut. We asked each of our partners like Portland to share demographic and staff data that they have in their systems, anything from their applicant data tracking system, so where candidates apply, any information on evaluation and compensation, student and school performance data, school rosters, classroom rosters, culture and climate surveys, if our partners did those, like Julia mentioned, Insight, which is an instructional culture survey for teachers, census data, nces.org data. That's where you see the data around like the national gaps between student and teacher identities. And then as this team talked about, just in terms of stakeholder engagement, there's a lot of surveys, a lot of focus groups, a good amount of interviews, and then just trying to cull data from any engagement activities that were already taking place, which this team had already done a tremendous amount of, and just trying to pull trends or information from that space.
Great. I'm looking, I don't see any new questions popping up. So as we like wrap up this conversation, would love to hear just like a 1 to 2 minute lens of advice that the three of you would give to folks who are in the same seat as you, some words of wisdom and, how to move forward and get started. Would love for you to just, kind of close us out with some parting words to keep us energized in this work.
I'm happy to start. I think, having the opportunity as a white person to learn from folks of color, if you have the opportunity to be granted that, like we got through the Educators of Color report and through a lot of the steps we've made after, that's an opportunity to then take action on it. We were able to really elevate some themes from that, and it has continued to inform our work moving forward. So my advice, I guess, would be don't let those things sit on the shelf because they really matter, and that can really help influence change. And that change is like when you lift up a group that has been marginalized, you lift up everyone, and that is literally what's happening in our district with everything that has come through initiatives since.
One really quick question that came through as you all were talking that I want to make sure that we answer, and we can maybe use this to kind of close out as well, is what would you say are the biggest data collection barriers? Are there data points you wish that you can or could collect?
I'll jump in, even though I'm less directly involved with the data, but I would say, just the capacity. We're short-staffed, and our HR and our data teams are so stretched thin. So I would say time, and then actually our software that we use and have purchased as a district is really limiting. So for us, those have been two really big barriers. I don't know if you want to jump in on that, either of you.
Okay, well, I think that might be time. I'm paying attention to the time. You always have time flies when you're having fun, but I am so excited that you all were able to join us and just share more about the powerful work that you're doing in Portland Public Schools. Thank you so much for being here, and we'll make sure that if folks want to get in contact with you after this webinar, we include your contact information in our follow-up. So thank you for being here, and we will start transitioning to some closeout conversation. Thank you all.
Yes.
So let's take a moment to pause as we're kind of closing out the conversation. And after hearing from Julia, Andy, and Barrett, what would you want to pull into the work as you think about your district? And what might be different about the work that you're doing in terms of educator diversity in your context? Just take a moment to create some space for yourself to just think about what nuggets you're pulling from this conversation and how you can apply that to your unique context. As we wrap up today's webinar session, we just want to leave you with some closing thoughts and action steps as you continue to prioritize educator diversity. We know that the national research is calling for each of you to better understand your local context and build a strategy around the humans that you serve. Just reiterating Christine's earlier comment, this is people work, and how are you keeping people and their stories at the center of what you're doing? It requires mindset shifts and being intentional in our actions to transform systems to improve outcomes for our young people and also for our educators, our adults. From a practice perspective, these 4 components are ones that we want to lift up for you as you continue your journey. Explore what diversity means for your kids, what it means for your community. Bring their voices, bring their experiences into your strategy. Keep them involved, keep them centered. Gather data strategically. Think about what data systems you're leveraging, what information you're collecting, specifically around race and ethnicity data, and thinking about what is essential for you to prioritize as you continue to move forward in your diversification efforts. You also need a strong leadership and team and a vision for this work. It is crucial for doing that vision setting and modeling the type of culture and engagement and changes that you hope to see in your community. Communicate that vision consistently and reflect on the values that you're walking in every day in your community. And then finally, develop a plan for engagement. Proactively plan to keep those that are closest to the work and who you hope to serve at the table. Think about their needs, create the activities, create the systems, create the structures that are aligned to what they need in order to stay mobilized and in partnership for this really important work. I also want to just lift up, some policy considerations as we think about the campaign. And Nithya is going to share a few things that the campaign is excitedly doing when we think about these considerations policy-wise.
Thank you, Stephanie. I will be very brief. We wanted to, as we close this session out, as we mentioned, this webinar series is very focused on practice and implementation, but this does not happen in a vacuum. State policy is absolutely critical, as is local and federal policy as well, particularly when it comes to data. So I won't read the slide, and you'll certainly have a recording post-webinar, but the 1 Million Teachers of Color campaign steering committee members stand as resource experts, and including both in practice and in policy. And we have a number of recommendations related specifically to data that you can see on the screen. And both practice and policy have to happen in order to bring this really important work to scale. Thanks, Stephanie. Oh, and I also just wanted to name, I'll drop in the chat here some really great resources from the Education Trust and Teach Plus, which also have done a lot of great work specifically around data and district work to bring these practices to scale. Back to you, Stephanie.
Thank you, Nithya. So think about what you've heard today. It's been a lot, and consider what data do you have available? What data do you want to collect? Who else from your teams and community should be involved? And how will you engage them? And what will it do over several years? Looking at data and engaging with key stakeholders is a continuous process that should be informing your work each and every day. Thank you so much for attending today's session. Our next webinar, Mobilizing Toward a Diverse Educator Workforce, is scheduled for October 18th. As a reminder, each of these sessions represents an essential step in your diversification strategy. So we encourage you to just remain in partnership with us as we explore these best practices. If you want to connect, please check out the campaign website or reach out directly to any of today's facilitators. It's been such a pleasure engaging with you today and hope that you have a wonderful rest of your afternoon. Be well, and we hope to see you at the next one next month. Bye.